Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Evie Lupine, and today we are continuing our Kink Fest interview series. And today we are speaking with Mollena Williams-Haas, and we're going to be talking about MSDS and taboo play. So, for those in the audience who may not know you, would you mind maybe giving a little bit of an introduction and your experience in BDSM?
Sure. In short, I suppose I should say I've been involved consciously in the kink and leather and alternative lifestyle communities pretty actively since 1995, ongoing to today. I would say, though, that my career as a sexually adventurous person started when I was in high school with my first high school boyfriend. So I've never considered myself anything but open to adventure and trying different things. I started getting involved in the kink communities actively when I was living in San Francisco. And I was there for 15 years before I moved back home to New York, where I grew up and where I am living now. A lot of my time now is spent in service. I am in a committed 24/7, 365 master-slave relationship. We also like to identify more as owner and property in order to have the MS language, which can often be triggering for some people, have that sort of put that to the side. My husband and I do a lot in terms of being very open and public with our kink and our relationship. We were recently the subjects of a documentary entitled The Artist and the Pervert, which is currently playing in various festivals all over the world, in fact. I think we've been on every continent at this point with the movie, so that's kind of amazing. And we're really, really glad to be able to be out for all the folks who really cannot or choose not to sort of plant our freak flag and say, hey, here we are, we're kinky, this is what we do, and we're always open to talk and to share with folks who are curious and willing to listen.
From what it sounds like, your documentary is primarily going over your relationship. So, would you mind talking a little bit more about what's in the documentary?
Yeah, the documentary came about because of the fact that there was a article in the New York Times that actually detailed our relationship. My husband is a very high profile, very well known composer in the contemporary music scene. So among those folks who know the contemporary music scene, he is very well known outside of that small bubble. People are like, who is he? I'm like, don't worry about it. It's all right. But he has, his pieces performed all over the world, so he's quite well known. And he had decided in an interview for a music blog, specifically to talk about his sexuality and about his life and his lifestyle. And once that hit, of course, the contemporary music scene is all abuzz with that. And when the gossip and everything else started circulating, I said to him, I think the Times is probably going to call within the next week or so, because they're not going to be able to resist having a story as juicy as, world famous composer is also a big old pervert and has a wife that he calls his slave. And, and to add to the intrigue, he is from Austria and quite white, and I am from New York City and African American, and so that was also challenging for a lot of people to accept. And the New York Times ran actually a lovely, very, very fair and balanced story in the arts section, which is not where you usually expect to see stories about perverts and kinky folks. And so that was delightful and amazing. As a result of that, a couple in Germany saw the article and had been thinking about doing a documentary on alternative lifestyle people. So they met up with us when we were traveling in Germany, talked to us, decided that they wanted to go ahead with this documentary and actually just focus on us rather than have it be several different people. So they basically started following us around the world. So we are in Europe quite often, so it was very easy for them to hop on a plane or a train and meet up with us when we were in Germany or Austria or England or France or wherever we were. They came over to the States a couple of times and filmed us in our native habitat, in our house, and when we were traveling. And they also happened to be filming during the year that Georg Friedrich and I were developing and performing a piece that we had worked on together. So the piece is called Hyena. Georg wrote the music for it. And I do a lot of spoken word and storytelling. And so the story basically is me talking about my recovery from alcoholism, and it is set to his music. And so they got to film us as we were rehearsing it, as I was developing it, and then as it was finally performed and had its world premiere in Vienna.
Yeah, and I actually, before this interview and I was doing a little bit of research, I ran across your interview you did with Sunny Megatron where you talked about the background behind Hyena and the process of all of it. And it's really interesting to figure out how all of these different things are connected and sort of it's definitely not usual that you would have somebody who's so high profile and even in a small segment of the vanilla world come out as being kinky and have that be received in a positive way. It's actually kind of a little bit reassuring that, the New York Times would run a pretty fair piece, even though it's something that could be very easily exploited for more, titillation for the readers, let's say.
What's been fantastic is that, of course, there's going to be people who object to power exchange relationships on general principle. And I'm accustomed to that. And there are certainly people who object to the idea of a woman who is, as I am, the actual descendant of non-consensual chattel slaves, somehow echoing that or upholding the racist dominant paradigm in her own personal relationships, which I don't agree with. There's a huge difference. I am consensually engaging in my relationship, whereas my ancestors did not have the opportunity to exercise consent or their own free will. What's been rather remarkable is that the only really negative feedback that we've gotten is sort of from people who are just kind of angry in general about other people and how they live their lives, and you're right. It has been reassuring that the majority of folks, especially after they see the documentary, kind of expecting it to be, pudgy middle-aged people's version of 50 Shades of Grey, come away with it and they say, well, actually, it's just a really lovely love story of people who care about each other and respect each other. And that's kind of great. And what we are so glad is that people have seen, rather than it being about what kink looks like, it's about our emotional connection, our journey, how we support each other, and how our choices have benefited both of us in really rather remarkable ways. And that's ultimately what I hope that people see and take away from the documentary, from our public interviews, from all the sharing that we do on social media, that all of it is a picture of folks who are living their best lives, really.
Is there a place where people can watch that now, like if they live in the States?
As of now, it is not fully released. They are still working on that. The filmmakers did just get a release deal for the German-speaking world, so it will be showing in Germany and Austria starting in a few months. And interestingly enough, they also got a contract for, I believe, Italy and the Vatican. So it is entirely possible. I know. I was like, really?
And the Vatican specifically, very interesting.
Because the Italian-speaking world has to stipulate the Vatican because it's its own state, right? So if people who happen to live in the country or the region that is the Vatican, they have to cut deals with distribution companies specifically, which is fascinating. And I just love the idea of knowing that there's going to be some cardinals who are going to sit down and surreptitiously pull it up. So it'd be like, oh, what is this thing? And I'm like, yeah, you guys know about perversion. You're in it to win it.
I mean, I was born and raised Catholic, and I know so many people in the community who were as well, and it's honestly not that surprising when you think about the dogma of the church. But yeah, I hope, fingers crossed that, we'll get an opportunity to see that over in the States.
Definitely. It's those sort of things that I had no idea how complicated these sorts of deals were to arrange, mostly because you can get anything on Netflix or on Amazon and everything and quote unquote have it out there, but then you'll make no money at all. And I really want the filmmakers who invested so much of their own money and literally over 2 years of their time to put this out there. And so I'm hoping that they can at least recoup some of their efforts. So that's where it is right now, trying to find a deal that makes it so that people can see it. And it's also fair to the folks who have invested in it, invested with their time and their energy. So I think it'll happen. It seems like there's really good interest in it. So that's great.
It's kind of a niche subject, but I think even just as like a human interest story, I imagine that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it'll probably come together, fingers crossed. On those lines of talking about, having healthy, loving, supportive relationships, I would love to hear from you. What do you consider MS to be? because I find that a lot of people, some people are very much MS is this like rigid structure based on leather culture, and there's other people who kind of see it as, whenever you use the term master as like a personal identifier. So what's your perspective on that?
My definition that I have landed on is that an MS or master slave or PE, which can stand for power exchange, relationship is a relationship between two humans of equal value and self-worth, where the dynamics of the power have been agreed upon to be unequal. So it is not about saying you are worthless, you are less than me, and therefore I am the boss of you. It is about saying we both have needs that are going to be met if we exist in this dynamic, and therefore we both agree to do so. It's incredibly vital to me, and that people understand that there's nothing about a healthy MS relationship that is about the humiliation or degradation of the human being themselves, right? You can be humiliated in a sexy way that's really hot. You can have that as part of your dynamic because it benefits you. But the moment that you are damaged or negatively impacted as a result of the humiliation or the degradation, and it's not part of your erotic life, and it's not part of your fetish, and it's not part of something that fulfills you emotionally, it becomes abusive. And the only thing that really separates MSDS, kink, BDSM from abuse is consent and the desire for all parties to come out the other end feeling better and more empowered and more uplifting. Intent and consent are the two big things. Someone who's slapped someone across the face, from the surface, that looks like violence. But if you fetishize pain, being slapped across the face might be the hottest thing ever. So you cannot look and know the difference. You have to feel it. You have to know that this is consensual, and you have to know it's the intent of all people involved in that face slapping, that it is pleasurable, that it is consensual, and that at the end of the day, everyone feels good about what happened.
So it's not about believing that X group is inherently lesser than, and that these type of people should always be submissive or are inherently submissive in some capacity, but that two otherwise equal people are entering into an agreed upon negotiated consensual relationship where their power levels just happen to be different.
That is correct. I understand that there are people who are supremacists in their beliefs, female supremacy, male supremacy, etc. I personally feel that those are troubling areas to enter, because you are assigning a particular position to folks based on a pre-existing criteria. And I do not believe that that lends itself to fair, equal, consensual, intentional, and conscious BDSM. Because if on some level you feel like you are better than someone, that you are superior to them, that they serve you because they should or they must, you've put yourself in a position of power that is not about you treating the other person with respect. And it is really hard to have a good relationship with a person, place, or thing that you do not respect. I mean, I would challenge anyone to show me a situation where they have a lack of respect for a concept or an idea or a human being or anything for that matter. And that's a good, healthy relationship. You have to have that level of respect. It's without it, I personally believe, of course, people can have their own opinions, but I personally believe that without that respect for the other parties involved, as someone who is as worthy of being on this earth and breathing the air and having love, if love is what they desire, and having attention and affection, which are basic human needs, that has to be central to the dynamic for it to be sustainable and for it to help the folks grow.
One of the other things too is, how is MS different from DS? So how is being in a master-slave relationship different from being in a dominant-submissive relationship? Are they different from intention or the level of power exchange, or just simply the labels we put on it?
It's going to be different for many different people. Some people see these things on an arc, like one is less intense than the other, and then the second is more intense than something else. For example, I've seen the arc go from top and bottom to dominant and submissive to master and slave, for example. The idea that someone who's doing a top and bottom scene has just decided, you know what, I'm going to be the person who gives the sensation. You're going to be the person who receives the sensation. And that's just how it's going to go. Those roles might be fluid, that people might switch the roles depending on what day it is or how they're feeling. And they're often in a top and bottom relationship. There is not necessarily an emotional or psychological component. It's mostly about the sensation. So you can be a rope top and like to tie people up, but not really want to tell them what to do or have any erotic charge to being the boss of someone or being bossed around by someone. In fact, there's certainly people who love rope bondage who will instruct knot by knot the person who's tying them up exactly how they want to be tied up, because it's not about them submitting or handing over their will. If you move to the next consideration of what dominance and submissive is, it's the idea that someone is calling the shots and someone is acceding to and agreeing to follow the shots. DS relationships oftentimes will have a psychological component. You could have DS without SM. There doesn't have to be a sadomasochistic component. It can be purely emotional. I've known some people who were a DS couple, for example, who eventually moved to a master-slave paradigm, where one of them was a completely gay man who had no sexual interest in women, and his slave and submissive was a heterosexual woman who had, no desire to have sex with her owner, but they had a strong bond in terms of their dynamic, in terms of her trusting him to take charge of her life. And so they each had their own partners, they each had their own lives outside of that dynamic, but within the dynamic, he called the shots and she did what he wanted him to do, and that worked out very well for them. My definition would be that dominance and submission is more about the psychology of who is doing what to whom. It can involve SM and sadomasochism. It might not. It usually does, though. And there's the idea that it might come and go. The idea that DS might be something that you engage in for a shorter period of time. The idea that your submission is something that you offer and can then rescind at any moment. And the idea that you can do a scene, for example, that might be a DS scene, but it might not encompass the rest of your life. People who will then identify as master slave, the core for many folks of what they want is a sensation of ownership or of being owned. So it's the idea that what gets you off, what turns you on, what you're really seeking is to have a relationship wherein you are seen as the property of belonging to the person who is in the M side of the slash there. And oftentimes those relationships are of a broader spectrum. They will encompass more of your life, for example, than, say, a top and bottom scene or a dominant and submissive scene. Generally, folks who are doing a master-slave relationship will see themselves as broadly committed to the dynamic as well as to the person or people who they pledge their loyalship and their fealty and whatever else they see as necessitating that type of dynamic. I hate to say this is how it is, because I know how I feel when someone tells me this is how things are, and if you are not following these directions, then you're doing it wrong. The whole point of leather and leather sex was that you had people who consider themselves to be sexual outlaws, who refused to be told what to do, who found their own way in a world that rejected them, this being gay leathermen of the 50s and 60s. And so the idea that there is one true way to do anything, really, I think for all sexual kinky folk, should be abhorrent. It should be, what do you need? How do you get your needs met? It might be, as you say, that the very rigid protocol turns you on, and that's fantastic. Or it may be that you just say to each other one day, okay, I belong to you. We're done. That's it. And then that's just how your lives are. So there's everything in between that spectrum. And as long as it's, as I say, consensual, and the intent is that folks feel fulfilled and happy and have some form of joy brought to their lives as a result of it, that's ultimately what it's about.
This has actually come up a couple times in the chats that I've been having with people for Kink Fest, is that kink is really what you make it. BDSM and your relationships are what you make it. And while we can kind of do these broad strokes, kind of an overview of generally this is what this means, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to look the same way for you as it does to another person's relationship or to other people in your local scene or anything like that.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, I know that there are some people who might look at my relationship with my owner and they might clutch their pearls in horror because I'm constantly chasing after him and yelling at him and fussing and whatever else. But that's the type of love that we have. And he knows that my fussing and my fretting and all of that is about my efforts to make his life better. And the relationships where I've had in the past where who I was suppressed and I voluntarily tried to suppress it in order to meet the demands of the people with whom I was in a relationship, those relationships all fell apart because it's not sustainable to be who you aren't. And if high protocol and rigid rules are what fulfills you, spectacular. There are people who, for example, make a lifetime of being submissives professionally. By them, I refer to anyone who's in the armed forces, right? There are people whose entire career is about submitting to the rigidity of what that means for them, that sort of discipline. I could never be a soldier. I would not do well there. And it's not because I'm weak. It's not because I'm not good about being loyal. It's about the fact that I do not want to submit to a larger idea that doesn't work for me. Submitting to a person works for me because it's hands-on, because I can see them, because I see their day-to-day struggles, and I can buy into supporting them. That's how my submission works. Now, how it breaks down in detail after that is entirely up to me day to day and entirely up to my owner day to day.
One of the things I did want to touch on as well is, have you always been in an MS relationship, or did at some point you transition into that from other styles of BDSM, or kind of what was your pathway to actually getting into this style of relationship?
I will say that I started off initially a very brief affair that then became sort of an ongoing long distance relationship with a guy. And it started off that we were doing all kinds of kinky sex, and my reaction to that was to feel like I wanted to wait on him hand and foot. And it didn't make any sense for me at the time. I was in my early 20s. I was a little confused. And so I assumed that this was one of these magical connections that could never be reproduced by anyone anywhere else with any other human being. This was this one singular person. And it took me the next few years to realize, actually, this kind of makes sense in the context of a dominant and submissive relationship where someone really enjoys and gets off on taking care of the other person. And so I said, okay, well, that's probably what I want. I then realized that a lot of my sexual fantasies about submission and about kink fell into the realm of the fascination with and eroticizing the sensation of being owned and belonging to someone else. The feeling that I could be someone's also intrigued me and turned me on. So once I went real time in the kink community, in the leather community, I said, okay, well, I want to be a slave and this is what I want. And so my first relationship was geared towards that. It was a DS relationship with someone who definitely looked to have MS relationships with his partners. And the way that he structured his life, there was always sort of like a getting to know you period, a dating period, a trial period, a temporary collaring period where you could see if that was what you wanted to do. It was very formalized and very, what's the word I'm looking for, very step-by-step, very structured. And initially that appealed to me because I thought, wow, I really get to earn my place and I really get to know this is who I am. And what was interesting is that what I started discovering was that these restrictions felt to me like a prison sentence. And it felt like I was always having to prove and achieve something that I really just wanted to be who I was. And initially, after that relationship did not work out, my assumption was, okay, I think the problem is I'm really not a slave because I see all these other people who call themselves slaves doing X, Y, and Z, and I don't want to do that, and I can't do that. So therefore, I must not be that. And there was a woman who I admire very much, Viola Johnson, who is one of the first Black women I saw, in the leather community, identifying herself as a slave, also giving me the sort of strength to stand up and say, that's me as well. And I had read some of her writings and I said, wow, she's so hardcore. This is so intense. I could never be that. That must mean I'm not a slave. And then I met her at one point at a leather convention, and I came up to her and I said, I'm a huge admirer of your your writings and your work and your presence. And thank you for being someone I could look to and not feel like I was a lone weirdo here. And I explained to her my situation and how she and her writings had helped me to understand that I was not a slave because I could not do that degree of self-sacrifice, that I could not give up who I was and become this empty vessel for the will of someone else. And she sort of looked at me with her head tilted to one side and said, okay, well, let's talk about that, honey. Because what she explained to me, and it took me a little bit to get this to heart, is she said, look, if you're a slave, that is something that's in your heart. It's not about what you do. It's about who you are. And the right owner, the right master, the right dominant, the right partner will see you and not need to break you on the wheel in order to have you shine. They will see you and put you in the correct setting, and you will shine. And I said, oh, well, I don't know that I'm going to find that person. And what's fascinating is that I had many relationships with people for short and long term over the next few years, but it did take another 2 decades before I found the person who I felt hit all the criteria in terms of being ready and being open and being worthy and being truly compassionate and having the amount of respect that I require, that I learned to understand that I should require from anyone else who I was going to enter into this dynamic with. So it was a long process.
That's important to recognize. I think sometimes there's this expectation that if you are a submissive, a master, slave, or whatever label you use, that's something that will just click with anybody. And if you're really that thing, it's not hard to find somebody who will work with you on that level, when in reality, this is a tiny little piece of a weird, of a weird activity that not very many people engage in. And it is a little bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack sometimes, trying to find that right person who just happens to unlock that part of your brain fully and allows you to get to that place. And if you don't mind me asking, if it took 2 decades to get to that place where you found somebody who did, tick all those boxes that you needed to be able to go to that place, how did you handle that in the interim? Was it something where you always felt like a deep longing for it, or you just kind of focused on other areas of your life, or how did you balance that?
Well, the part of me that felt drawn to service was something that I diverted to other forms of service. I started doing service in the kink community. I started lecturing. I started, going around and teaching at different events. And I had relationships. I had wonderful, fulfilling, awesome relationships with folks. And the thing that I discovered, which is part of the message I hope to carry forth to other folks, is that while people in the BDSM and kink and leather communities have made this decision to come and say, I'm kinky and this is who I am, and now I'm going to negotiate these scenes, and this is how my life is going to be, there are millions of people out in the world who maybe haven't taken that step, but are completely open to the type of relationship where maybe things are a little kinky and maybe there is a power imbalance. I had a guy who I dated for a couple of years who was very aware of the kink community and thought it was sort of silly that we, made a big deal about going to hotels on the weekend and beating each other in the basement. He's like, I can just do that at home. Why would I bother? Why am I going to go and spend $150 on a flogger when I can just grab a belt and spank you with that? He's like, doesn't make any sense. And he was one of the freakiest people I had ever dated. Did he call himself a dominant? Absolutely not. Did we have the exact same kind of activities and dynamic that I had with other folks who were specifically engaged in the scene? Absolutely, yes. When I would explain to him that basically what he's doing is a DS relationship, he would sort of laugh at me. But then if I put into the context of sort of a traditional 1950s era housewife, with the slippers being presented, dinner being on the table, and all of your needs being catered to, he was like, well, of course is how you're doing things. He didn't see it as intrinsic to how women should behave, but he was like, that's how I like my partners to be. Because I love it. I turns me on. And if I'm going to date someone, I would like to know that turns them on too. So he was engaging in that degree of consent, but just not calling it that. And so I had a couple of relationships in that way. And I had some relationships that were emotionally very connected and really intense and really wonderful, even though they were not ever going to lead to a committed collared master-slave relationship, they were there to fulfill that need for a time. And so I enjoyed a full and awesome life in that interim. So I wasn't missing out. One of the things I like to tell people when I finally did have the realization that I wanted to let go of the sort of feeling of longing is that the years that I had between realizing who I wanted to be and actually living the life of who I wanted to be was development. Some development is instantaneous and very quick, and some of it takes longer. And the reality is the person I was the day I met my current owner/husband is not the person I was 20 years ago when I set out on this journey. That person would not have been ready for this degree of connection. And the person who I'm currently with was not ready. He wasn't there. He was, across the ocean, married to someone else. And so part of what you have to look at is that sometimes things take longer than you think you want them to for several reasons, for many reasons. I am a recovering alcoholic and I've been sober since 2007. And I have to say, prior to that sobriety, I would not have been a very good submissive or slave because I was serving an addiction. And it's super difficult to serve addiction and another person, right? And so I have to look at basically a reset button being pressed when I got sober and say, okay, wow, those years were not a total train wreck. It wasn't a blackout. It wasn't a horrible mess, but it wasn't good. And there were a couple of pretty horrible moments. And once I got sober and once that came together, I gave myself the time to start to heal and let my life back into my life and live life on life's terms and all of that shit. And at that point, I was able to say, okay, wow, maybe now I am ready for someone. Maybe part of that delay was making sure that I didn't fritter away a wonderful opportunity and hurt a wonderful person by trying to do this impossible task of being an addict and being someone else's property. You can't do it. It's not ever going to work.
One of the things that you're known for, and actually how I was introduced to your work, is there's the book Playing Well with Others, which you had worked on with Lee Harrington. There's also the little blue pocketbook guides, and you wrote the one on taboo play. And I know that's definitely still an area that is very, obviously it's taboo, so it's sensitive for a lot of people. And I know in our community here, we've actually had discussion groups about it, which has been really nice because I think it's something that people tend to sweep under the rug a little bit and just kind of da-da-da. Everybody is never having any problems with anybody else's kinks, and we all love each other unconditionally, and it's all good.
And I was like, I say, guess what? Not.
Yeah, guess what? Not always the case. Let's talk about, what does taboo kink actually mean? What are we saying when we say something's a taboo kink?
Well, if something is taboo, the idea is that it goes against some cultural norm. And that's a very basic definition. Something that is taboo is something that goes against a cultural norm. Now you say, okay, well, what's a cultural norm? Well, that's going to be different based on whatever, A, you consider your culture, B, where you are in the world, C, what generation you are, right? Because my parents' generation, being openly gay in the street was a huge taboo. It was definitely problematic. Now, is it 100% okay everywhere in America all the time? No, it is not. But has the taboo shifted? Yes, it has. And so taboo also is something that is very fluid. And in my opinion, what is taboo is also sometimes going to be intensely personal. It can be your own personal culture. For myself, I don't see, for example, any sort of water sports, any piss play as being particularly taboo because it's urine. It's not that big a deal. If you are a healthy person, if you're a healthy adult, your urine is also pretty healthy. It's a waste product. So, it's a human natural biological thing, not that big a deal. But for some folks, the idea of someone even listening while they pee is a huge problem and the worst possible, dirtiest, naughtiest thing you could possibly think of. And so when you look at taboos, they're oftentimes really personal. And so when I teach these classes, what I try to let people know is what taboo is what taboo means to you. Don't be ashamed that your taboo thing is run of the mill and quote unquote boring to someone else, and they roll their eyes and they're like, oh, whatever, that's how can you call that taboo? Because it's taboo for you. And all of those things are going to be intensely personal. There are some taboos that are pretty obvious. There are some things that I think on a high cultural level, we can all agree are bad. You know, there's a strong cultural taboo against incest, for example, and there's a good reason for that. Children cannot consent in any meaningful way to engaging in some sort of contact with an adult, especially not an adult in their family. The taboo against incest prevents bad behavior because it encourages people to not engage in sexual relationships within their own family. That's bad for the gene pool, you know, all of these other things. However, there absolutely is in the kink and leather communities a whole subculture of mommy boy and daddy girl play where people have these very dark fantasies that involve that kind of language. Again, it's not going to be with chronological children, but it might be with someone who's pretending to be a bad little boy or a bad little girl and is getting a spanking from a parent that then becomes eroticized. Is that a very dark type of play? It can be. Is it considered to be taboo by the broader community? For some people, it's not that big a deal. Again, some people see a daddy girl scene and they're like, yeah, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I've seen that before a million times. And for some people, it would be completely forbidden and something they could never, ever approach. And so I try to encourage people to look at what is taboo for them first, see where their boundaries are around it, if it's something that they want to do, if it's something that should just remain within the realm of fantasy, because a lot of people forget that fantasies are critical to our development as kinky people. And whether or not we act on those fantasies with other human beings doesn't make it any less erotic, any less hot, or any less a part of your sex life.
And it sounds like in some ways it's a little bit like humiliation in that it is very individual. Yeah. Like there's nothing that's universally humiliating. And in the same way, there's nothing, you know, that's universally taboo, except for maybe going into things like incest. But even then, if you're just playing with the idea of incest in like in a controlled consensual situation, that kind of eliminates the taboo element for some people.
You know, I had this conversation with someone, they were like, okay, why are things, why is incest taboo, for example? It's like, well, you know, to present inbreeding. And I said, so if it's let's say it's two brothers and they're both 18 and they want to have sex, is that still, and you see people squirming, they're like, oh, I said, but you know, this is why it's multi-layered. It's not just one reason. Many of us have kind of soaked into our bones that these things are bad and they're terrible. And then when you pull them apart, you see it's not just one monolithic reason, it's several reasons. And even when you look at the logical stuff and you eliminate, if you do a thought exercise, like with the two gay brothers, if you pull those things apart, you're still like, I still don't think it's cool.
Exactly. Like, I think sometimes people, especially with incest, they do go to that, oh, well, it's the reason why is because there's this, like, deep biological reason for it. But, like, it wasn't that uncommon, like, 200 years ago for people to marry and have children with their first cousins. And, like, today, for a lot of people, that would still fall under, like, the incest taboo. So, in regards to taboo play, I think there's two big areas that people have concerns with. And one would be talking to a partner when you want to do something that kind of falls in the generally understood taboo realm. And then two is, how do I engage in this as a member of like the public BDSM community in an ethical way? The
problem with talking to other folks is that there's definitely a fear and trepidation of rejection. It's completely understandable to fear that if you share with someone this deep, dark secret, that they're going to recoil from you in disgust. And so I tell people, look, this is very real. That might happen to you. Therefore, you have to decide if you need to know or if you really want to be with someone for whom a piece of who you are is abhorrent. And let's say you never have that conversation. That's a part of your relationship that you will never know about. I would rather put it all out there on the table and say, here's all the fucked up stuff. Here's everything. If there's a piece of this smorgasbord that's turning your stomach, you need to find a different buffet, my friend, because this is part of who I am. But there's some people for whom that is not worth it. And when I sort of do the thought exercise in my classes where I say, sometimes things are best left in your head and only you can know if that's the case. But if it's something that you have been processing and it has been with you for a long time, and a part of you feels genuinely missing or unfulfilled, and it's worth it to roll the dice and see if the person or people in your life can help you fulfill that, then jump in there. Because essentially, if you say to someone, I really have this fantasy, I really want to do scat play, I've always wanted to do it, and if I don't have it, I can't like go to my grave without knowing that this is something I've wanted to do and I never did it. And your partner's like, oh my God, you're disgusting, what a horrible person, that grossed out. Then maybe that's not the sort of person you wanted to partner with. Maybe it's better that you know, or maybe it isn't, in which case then you have other options. You can find someone for whom this is erotic and make arrangements to have an ethical, non-monogamous play relationship with someone who shares your fetish. That's often a way people will handle that. But I encourage people to think long and hard about what they're willing to sacrifice to have this fantasy or this need or this desire or this fetish become reality, because you can't put that back in the box once it's out there. And the thing is that I feel like many more people are more accepting of folks once they realize that it's not necessarily about them. If someone has a fetish that you think is really gross or you just don't get it, it's not about you. It's about them and their desires. So if you put it in the context of, well, maybe I don't have to participate in a way that makes me uncomfortable, but maybe I can help this person fulfill their desire in some other way. But you can't ever know that. You can't ever have that conversation until you roll the dice and take that risk. So that's, I always tell people, I'm like, I can't answer that for you, but please put that into your basket when you're rolling things around and thinking about it. In terms of dealing with the broader community, I think, again, this is a two-edged sword, because we are all responsible for ourselves as adults. The whole purpose of the kink community is to give folks a place to express themselves freely and all of that. However, again, there are certainly some taboos that we can all be aware have a higher likelihood of being triggering, difficult, or problematic in the current culture where you are living. And while it is not necessarily your responsibility to babysit everyone, isn't life better when we treat our neighbors with some respect in terms of not overstepping their boundaries? And so the idea of walking into a dungeon, like, for example, I've done some very intense scenes that involved racial issues. The thing is that the person who ran the dungeon was made aware of what was going to happen. The dungeon monitors were aware of what was going to happen. And so they were able to deal with anyone who might have a question or an issue. We did our best to make sure that the environment was aware of what was going to be going on. I'm going to juxtapose that with a situation where someone came to a kink event in another. It wasn't where I was. It was somewhere I was traveling to, and there had been this huge blow up. And the day I got there, they were like, oh my gosh, we're so glad you're here, because last week there was a party and it was like a regular Friday night dungeon party, and someone walked in their full Nazi regalia, and a bunch of people got really pissed off. And this person was like, well, this is my fetish, this is my thing, so, deal with it. And the thing is this, you can reasonably assume that if you walk in dressed in the uniform of people who committed one of the worst genocides in contemporary history, that people are going to be upset by that. If he had said to the dungeon owner, hey, you know what, I'm coming to the party in my Nazi regalia, then the dungeon owner could have said, okay, well, we're going to let folks know on the party invite list that this is going to happen. Or could you maybe just do your scene in this part of the dungeon space where folks can be advised, with a sign coming up saying, hey, if you go over to the medical play area, there's someone doing this like Nazi torture scene. So just don't go over there if you want to see it. Give people the opportunity to make a choice about what they're seeing. Because if I'm someone for whom that's a very triggering image, once I've seen it, there's nothing I can do. Perhaps my night has now been derailed. On the third hand, I had a woman come up to me, this is many years ago when I was with my first dominant, and I had just done a rope bondage scene. A woman came up to me at the snack table, just stressed and upset. She's, saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe I had no idea I was going to be walking in here and seeing this race play scene, and you guys should warn people. And I looked at her and I said, what scene are you talking about? She goes, well, your scene. I said, my scene. I said, you did not see a race play scene. There was nothing about that. I said, my dominant is like, crunchy California guy. He can't even say the phrase, the N word, without feeling uncomfortable. You sure as hell didn't see him do anything around race. And we're going back and forth. And I said, look, honestly, what did you see that upset you so badly? And she said, well, I just walked in the dungeon and there you are, like, a black woman, and there's a white man with a whip and he's got you, covered in rope. And I said, okay, so basically, because I'm black and he's white, the suspension bondage scene that you saw that also happened to have a short whip involved in it became a lynching scene. I said, do you understand that has nothing to do with me? So do you understand that had nothing to do with him? I said, I understand that this is not a huge leap to make and that it bothered you, but you don't have the right to come over here and yell at me because of what you saw and what your brain did. It's like, that's outrageous. And I realized at that point, I was like, oh my God, there's shit I'm going to do that regardless is going to upset people. And so I started trying to figure out what degree of responsibility is mine and what degree of responsibility is that of other people around me. And you have to know, whatever you do, it's going to be too much for someone. You just have to be prepared to deal with the person who comes up to you at the snack table upset later.
And unfortunately, it does happen. And it's so fascinating to me when that happens, where people insert kind of their own perception of what's happening in the scene, even if they're not a part of it and that was not your intent, just merely by combinations of certain factors. And I've even had it, like, friends have told me stories about they've had interactions with people where they're a female submissive and they have a male dominant, and there's not even any, racial difference between people playing, but just merely because somebody who is presenting as female is acting in the submissive role, people just get offended by that and have giant issues, and it's anti-feminist, and there's whole books talking about BDSM and feminism and if those two are compatible or not. But it's very interesting when people just see things and assume that they must be motivated for reasons that they're not necessarily motivated by.
Exactly. And over the years, I've gone from feeling like I had to explain it to everyone to feeling very defensive, to feeling like, I could at least get people to understand it, even if they didn't accept it, to finally saying, you know what, I'm living my life. Here is the substantial body of work I have done in interviews, in podcasts, in articles that I have written all over the internet. If you want to hear about it, you can certainly find it. I have a page on my website where I've gathered together a bunch of different resources because I was tired of answering the same damn questions. And I finally said, if you have read all of that and you still have something you want to ask me about it, that's fine. If you want to come to one of my classes or book one of my classes, that's great. But it's not my job to sit you down and talk you through this, especially if you have a hostility towards it. Because if you don't like it, if you find it offensive, if you feel like you are potentially being harmed by it, it's not my responsibility to try to put you off of that. Everyone is completely entitled to their feelings and opinions. I certainly have had some very serious repercussions and some that have been very sad for me from other Black female submissive people who think that even talking about two purpose specific play around race is harmful to them, and they wish I would shut the fuck up. And that is a little bit of a harder smack down to put up with, because I feel like, wow, we are dealing with a lot of racism and a lot of microaggressions and a lot of macroaggressions. And I don't want to add to the burden of someone else who I know is struggling. And so, to those folks, I will say you are right. It is scary. It is potentially harmful. And I respect your opinion and I respect your pain. And that's all I can say, because I'm not going to fight with them and try to explain it any further. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, you probably don't want to.
It's mostly, it sounds like, if somebody is not okay with it, they're just not going to be okay with it. And it's more about mitigating than it is like convincing somebody that something's okay.
Yeah, no, I actually don't believe that that's really possible. I think that there's some people who have the idea that it's bad and terrible and fucked up, and somewhere in there's still a curiosity. And I can tell by the line of questioning when people are coming at me and they're like, but why? And this and that. It's very different than you are a disaster, you are fucked up. And so to those people, I'm like, woo, okay, yes, because they've already made a judgment. And it's not my job to fight against that. People who don't understand it and are like, and are saying, you know what, I don't get it. That to me is an inside. I can say, I can't explain to you anything except what I'm doing. And if my explanation makes any sense to you, that's great. If it still doesn't, then it's not a thing you'll get. And that's okay. Everyone doesn't understand everything. There's plenty I don't understand, and I do my best to do so, and then I move on. Life is too short, as they say.
So if somebody was interested in engaging in taboo play, how would you recommend going about doing that, particularly if you are in a public setting? Like, I know you mentioned getting the venue aware of it and make sure that dungeon monitors or whoever's going to be observing the play is aware. Is there anything else that you would want to keep in mind if you did want to engage in taboo play in a public space?
Yeah, one of the things I encourage people to do is what started happening in the Bay Area when I was coming up there is that there were taboo theme parties. And themed parties are so common. There's uniform night, or pet play night, where everyone's like, bring your favorite pony, bring your favorite puppy, whatever. Have a taboo play night, in which case the whole point is we are here to do fucked up stuff. Don't even come in the door if it's not your gig. And to me, again, you're not going to guarantee that everyone's going to be hunky-dory with everyone else's stuff, because that will never happen, because perverts are too human to agree about everything. However, it does set the stage so that folks feel like they can make a choice about whether or not they want to be there. If you do not have the wherewithal to suggest to a party host to have a themed party, then the next step I would say would be to have a semi-private party in a venue, a home party. A lot of folks will often have their own sort of private tricked out dungeons and have maybe 6 or 10 of their closest friends over for a party, so that everyone knows in advance what's going on. That's the next level of awesomeness. The third level, again, if you are at a venue, try to find a venue where there is a space where people can make a choice to come over and see what you are doing or not. In larger events, this is pretty easy, because they're oftentimes, especially at events that are held at hotels, there will be smaller and more private dungeon areas. So, at a hotel event, it's very common to have the main ballroom where there's all the big equipment, all the suspensions and all the lights and the sound and whatever else, and then maybe a smaller side dungeon for quiet play, or a medical playroom where there's specifically tarps everywhere, so that if bodily fluids are shared, no one is having to deal with some sort of insane cleanup. You can then say, this is the taboo area. So if you are doing a scene in here, you can expect to open the door and see something that might be a little bit heavy. My main thing is to think about ways where you can allow people to consent to seeing what they're going to see, because that makes you a really awesome citizen. It doesn't mean you're a bad person if you do something else, but if you want to be super cool, I feel that being proactive about making sure that what you're sharing is being shared by people who have given their enthusiastic consent by opening that door and walking in the room, or by RSVPing to that private party or to that theme night. Those are folks who are aware and who are going to bring a better energy to the space.
In general, in kink, I think being courteous will get you pretty far, and especially when you know you're doing things that may make other people uncomfortable, being as proactive about it as possible will ingratiate you. It maybe not even necessarily with everybody who goes, but at least with the venue, that you didn't just show up in your Nazi uniform and strutted through the party without thinking about it twice.
Exactly. Or thought about it a lot. And this is also one of the things that I found about folks who tend to roll over other people's boundaries. It's what they want to do. They want to top the room. They want to shock. They want to get that reaction. And to me, that is a whole other level. But I know for a fact, because I've heard it from the mouths of a couple of people who've pulled these shenanigans, that they loved the discomfort and the controversy. They got off on that. And so my thing is, even if that's not your purpose, do you want people to think it was? Do you want people looking at you going, oh, here's this jerk again, trying to top the whole room with their bullshit?
I know we've talked a lot about being in the community and handling taboo kink within the community, because the last point I'd like to touch on, because I know we're running out of time here, is how do you have any advice for people coming to terms with an interest in a taboo kink that's sort of come up in their minds. That could be, you know, age play or race play or whatever it happens to be. Do you have any advice for kind of coming to that understanding and hopefully acceptance of wanting that activity?
I think the first thing you have to do is to forgive yourself for being who you are, which sounds like an obvious thing and sort of like a what? What are you talking about? But the reason people feel guilt or shame is because that's been imposed on you. Generally, kids are shameless, guiltless little balls of germs, right? Like little kids don't care. They'll run around naked, they'll play with their genitals, they'll, squat on the floor and poop if they have to, because they're coming into their bodies and their consciousness and they're doing whatever feels good in that moment. And from the moment we're born, we start having rules imposed on us to tell us what is and is not right, what is and is not healthy, what is and is not sanitary, who you are, who you aren't, what your gender role is, where you fit into society, depending on how wealthy or poor you are. All this shit just gets piled on from the moment you've opened your eyes. Or some people would argue even before, when you're still in the womb, yeah? So one of the things you have to first say is, who I am is fine. And a lot of people will try to ascribe some sort of issue, some sort of problem, some sort of psychological damage, some sort of traumatic event to their fetish, to their fantasy, and whatever else. And my thing is this: let us say that yes, you had some traumatic event that makes it so that you really get hot and bothered by age play. Okay, maybe age play is a way for you to reclaim your power around that traumatic event. Maybe age play is a way for you to flip the script. Maybe it's a way for you to reclaim a part of your body that's always felt bad or dirty to you because of something that happened to you when you were a kid. There's so many reasons people play around with taboo stuff. It's very interesting that the origin of the word taboo is from a Polynesian word, tapu, which just meant something that was holy or sacred. And so something that was forbidden because it was sacred. And I always want to pose people the point of colonialism took something that was sacred and made it profane. And you can decolonize your body and your sexuality by taking this something that's profane and making it sacred for you again. And making it something that is a beautiful and wholesome part of who you are. I don't care what it is. Now, once you choose to bring it into the world and manifest it with other people, there's a whole bunch of other shit you've got to sort through, pun intended. But while you are processing the yes or no, the who am I, give yourself permission to be a completely awesome and fantastic person who also has this fetish or this desire that might fall outside the mainstream, but that just adds to your uniqueness. That just adds to who you are as a unique and really interesting person. And so once you've gotten to the point that you can feel good about jerking off to your nasty, dirty fantasy, you will have come a long way towards healing that guilt and that shame. Because guilt and shame should really only exist if it turns you on and you want it to be there. Otherwise, it's useless. It's completely a construct to keep people feeling badly about themselves and keep us in line. If you release yourself of your guilt or shame about your desire to pretend to be a pony or to put on a diaper and sit in your own poop, like, great. That is one less thing for you to feel bad about in your life. Don't you have enough? Don't we have enough stuff to feel crap about? And so that's my first recommendation is find a way to love this part of yourself, even if it's dark, or especially if it's dark, because we all have those dark corners. And aren't you brave for going into those corners and deciding consciously to explore that? And then to find like-minded people. We live in an age where literally everything has a discussion group for it on the internet. When I was coming into the community, there were just the front end of internet relay chat. And so people were talking about these taboo subjects, these crazy, freaky sex things. It was like the second thing that happened on the internet. The first thing was aerospace and government shit. The next thing was freaky sex. And so people jumped right on that. Like the second it hit, people were like, oh, we can send electronic mail to, from NASA to the Fed. Great. I can also send electronic mail to this hot person who I know in this other lab. And now we're going to talk about our spanking fetish. And so it really has blossomed into a way for people to explore even anonymously and to rehearse and to work out those muscles of being comfortable with who you are and finding folks who also share that interest. And stacking the deck so that you have a better chance of meeting a like-minded person. And that's really is so liberating and so freeing. And once you have that in your arsenal of positivity, of supporting your own self, the possibilities are endless and really fantastic.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave the conversation. And I love what you said about the origin of the word taboo, because I'd never heard that before. But I think that's a really, really interesting thing to think about. And I would definitely encourage people to think more deeply about it if it's something that resonates with them. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and sharing your insights. Is there anywhere where people can reach out to you or find more information from you if they're curious?
My website is Mollena.com. That's Mollena. You can also access it via The Perverted Negress, which is also the same site, but just a different name, because why not have two domains? I write a lot on Facebook, so you can find me and follow me there. I'm on Instagram as Milena_Lee_Williams_Haas. That's HAAS, not HASS like the avocado, which a lot of people confuse it with. And I'm like, no, actually, in German, Hass means hate, which is very funny because now every time I walk into the market, it's like, hey, these hate avocados are only $1.99 each. And I'm on Twitter as well, but I'm not so much a Twitter, but if you Google me, you can find me in all sorts of places.
All right. Well, hopefully people will be able to see you there. And if people do have any comments or questions, they can leave that down in the comment section of this video below. Links to everything will be in the description box. And until I see you guys next time, hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.